what would you say? Any job, any set of skills implies that you're good at a small set of things and then not good at an incredibly large number of other skills. It simplifies things. And so you can use your aim as the basis of a category structure. And so you also have to keep that in mind, because what it means is, as far as I can tell, that what it means is that your category system itself, which is what structures your perceptions, is actually dependent on the ethics of your aim. It's a moral thing. It's directly dependent on your aim. And that's a stunning idea if it happens to be true. It's not how people think about thinking. We don't think that way. We think deterministically, let's say, or that we think empirically, or that we think rationally. And none of that appears to be the case. What we do is we posit a valid aim, and then we organize the world around the aim. And there's plenty of evidence from that in psychological studies of perception, right? That does look like how the perceptual systems work. Mostly they ignore, because the world's too complicated. They focus on a small set of phenomena deemed relevant to whatever the aim is. And then, of course, the aim is problematic. Again, it's complex, because the aim I have has to be an aim that some of you share or at least don't object to, because otherwise I'm not going to get anywhere with my damn aim. It has to actually be implementable in the world. It has to be sustainable across at least some amount of time. It can't kill me. Like, it's really hedged in, this aim. It isn't any old thing. There's hardly any things that it can be. So, Jacob's aim, for example, in undermining Esau almost gets him killed. And you can understand why. That's the other thing. You think, well, that was a nasty bit of work. You can understand Esau's rage. It's, even though we're separated from the people in these stories by, 4,000 years, 3,000 years, something like that, immediately why everyone feels the way they do, at least once you understand the context of the story. That none of that's mysterious in the least. So there's the church, and the church is underneath the cross. Right, and so that's St. Peter's Basilica. And so there's the cross on the globe on top of the basilica, and then there's the cross on the obelisk as well. And so what that means is that, and this is where things get insanely complicated, is that the center is defined by whatever the cross represents. Now, the cross represents a crossing point geographically. It's certainly that. The cross probably represents the body to some degree. But then the cross also represents the place of suffering, obviously. And more importantly, it represents the place of voluntary suffering transcended. I'm speaking psychologically, right? Not theologically. That's what it represents. And so you might say, so here's the idea behind putting down the obelisk with the cross and saying that that's the center. So that's the thing that everyone's aiming at. And so the idea would be, well, if you're going to be a member of the group defined by this obelisk, then what you do is accept your position at the center of suffering voluntarily and therefore transcend it. That's the idea. And that is one hell of an idea. It really is, man. That is a killer idea. Because it's actually a signal, it's a really clear signal of psychological health. Because one of the things you do if you're a clinical psychologist and someone is paralyzed by fear is what you do is you break their fears down into relatively manageable bits, and then you have them voluntarily confront their fears. And it might also be things that they're disgusted by, say if they have obsessive compulsive disorder, but it produces very strong negative emotion, whatever it is. And then you have them voluntarily confront whatever it is that produces that overwhelming negative emotion, and that makes them stronger. That's what happens. It doesn't make them less afraid. It makes them more courageous and stronger, and that is not the same thing. It's seriously not. It doesn't decrease the fear. It increases the courage. And so that's a mind-boggling idea. And it's deeper You know, one of the things that's really interesting about these archetypal ideas is that, and maybe it's partly because of the hyperlinked nature of the Bible, that's part of it, but it's not the whole thing, is that no matter how deep you dig into them, you'll never get to the bottom. You know, you hit a bottom, you think, God, that's so unbelievably profound. And then if you excavate a little underneath that, you find something else that's even more profound. And you think, wow, that's got to be the bottom. And then you dig under that, it's like there's no bottom. You can just keep digging down. Well, as far as I can tell, you can keep digging down layer after layer. And we'll talk a little more about what the cross signifies as the center. Because you see, what people were trying to figure out is, what is it that we need to unite under, right? What's the proper thing to unite under? I can give you another example. So in the Mesopotamian societies, the emperor, who was more or less an absolute monarch, he lived inside what was essentially a walled city. And the god of the Mesopotamians was Marduk. And Marduk was the figure who had eyes all the way around his head, and he spoke magic words. So he was very attentive and very articulate. And it was Marduk who went out and confronted the goddess of chaos, the dragon of chaos, and cut her into pieces and made up the world. Okay, so you can kind of understand what that means. So Marduk goes beyond the frontier into the place of predatory chaos and encounters the thing that's terrifying and then makes something productive out of it. So it's a hero myth. And Marduk is elected to the position of preeminent god by all the other Mesopotamian gods because he manages that. So the Marduk idea emerges up the holy dominance hierarchy and hits the pinnacle. And God only knows how long that took. It would be the amalgamation of many tribes, and then the distillation of all those tribal myths to produce this emergent story of what constitutes top god. And then the job of the emperor was to act out Marduk. That's what gave him sovereignty. So the reason that he was the center around which people organized themselves wasn't because when he was being a proper emperor, it wasn't because there was something super special about him. Like the power didn't exactly reside in him, which is a really useful thing to separate, right? You want the power, which is why it's kind of nice to have a symbolic monarch. You get the symbolic power separated from the personality power, right? Because otherwise they get conflated. That's what happened in Rome. You can see it tending to happen now and then in the U.S., like with the Kennedy dynasties and that sort of thing. So the idea was the emperor had sovereignty as long as he was acting out Marduk properly and going out into the chaos and cutting it into pieces and making order. That was his job. So they used to take him outside the city on the New Year's festival and strip him of all his emperor garments and humiliate him and then force him to confess all the ways that year he hadn't been a good Marduk. So he wasn't a good ruler. And so that was supposed to clue him in and wake him up, right? And then they would ritually reenact the battle of Marduk against Tiamat, the chaos monster, using statues. And then if that all went well, then the emperor would go back in and the city would be renewed for another year. And we still have echoes of that in our New Year's celebration, right? It's the same idea that's echoed down all those centuries, thousands of years. So it's such a staggeringly brilliant idea, right? So part of the idea is that the thing that's sovereign, so that's the pillar at the center that everyone gathers around, is, at least in part, the thing that courageously goes out into the unknown and makes something useful out of it for the community. So that's very, very smart. It's very smart. So this is another example of a center. So this is the flag, this is the Union Jack, and so it's made up of a bunch of crosses, right? And so the first cross, the English cross, that's the flag of St. George, that's the flag of England. And what does St. George do? Slays the dragon, exactly, same idea, right? So St. George, patron saint of England, goes out and slays the dragon and frees the virgin from the grip of the dragon. Same idea, right? So that's the center. And then the second cross is called a saltire, but it's another crucifix. So it's the cross on which St. Andrew was crucified. So it's the same idea. It's the center is the center of suffering voluntarily undertaken, because St. Andrew was a martyr. And then St. Patrick is the third cross. What did St. Patrick do in Ireland? Chased out all the snakes. Right, so it's the same thing, right? And so the flag of Great Britain is the combination of all of these three crosses that defines the center, and that's what the flag is. So that symbolizes all of that. So that's, completely mind-boggling. So, and there's more about St. Patrick too. So he banishes the snakes after a 40-day fast, and so that's an allusion to the 40 years that Moses spends in the desert, and also the 40 days that Christ fasts in the New Testament. And his walking stick, when he plants it, grows into a tree, so that echoes all of the ideas about the center that we just described. And he also speaks with the ancient Irish ancestors, which, if you remember, is a characteristic of the shamanic rituals where so in the typical shamanic ritual, which seems to be elicited by psychedelic use, the shaman dissolve down past their bones, and then they go up into heaven and speak with the ancestors, and then they're introduced into the heavenly kingdom, and then the flesh is put back on their bones, and they come back and tell everybody what happened. And that's a repeatable experience, right? The shamanic tradition is unbelievably widespread. So all over Europe, ancient Europe and Asia, and perhaps as far down as South America, right? It's highly conserved, and it's out of that tradition, in all likelihood, that our religious ideation emerged. So, and you can see echoes of that here. So back to the story of Jacob and his ladder. So that I can come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. So that's also an echo, I would say, of the obligation of those who climb the power hierarchy to attend to those who are at the bottom, right? Because if you think about the tithing as a form of wealth distribution, which is essentially what it is, part of the ethic that defines the proper moral endeavor that's related to that center is not to advance yourself at the expense of the entire community. So if you're fortunate enough so that you can rise in authority and power and competence within the confines of a community, you still have an obligation to maintain the structure, maintain and further the structure of the community within which you rose. And that's obvious, right? Because if people didn't do that after a couple of generations, the whole thing would fall apart. So, it's not reasonable to destroy the game that you're winning. It's reasonable to strengthen the game that you're winning. And so that's another thing, because that also describes the ethic that should allow you to be an active member of the community around which that gathers around that center. So one of the things I've learned about the hero mythology that I really, really like is, so you see this pretty clearly in the figure of Christ, but because two things are conjoined in that story. But Christ is also the hero. There's two kinds of heroes. There's the hero that goes out into chaos and confronts the dragon of chaos and gathers the treasure as a consequence and then shares it with the community. That's one. The other form of hero is the hero who stands up against the corrupt state and rattles the foundation of the state, has it collapse, and then reconstructs it, right? So, because the two great dangers to human beings are unprotected exposure to the catastrophes of the natural world and subjugation to tyranny, right? Those are the two major dangers. And so the ultimate hero is the person who reconstructs the structure of the state by using the information that he gathered by going out into the unknown. That unites them both. And so what that means, here's the rub, as far as I can tell. So a structure, a center, has two risks associated with it. One is that it will degenerate into chaos, and the other is it will rigidify into tyranny. And it'll degenerate into chaos even if it just stays doing what it's doing. So if it just does exactly what it's doing and it doesn't change, it will degenerate. Because things change, and if it doesn't change to keep up, then it gets farther and farther away from the environment, and it'll precipitously collapse. And then if it just changes willy-nilly so that nobody can establish a a stable, centralizing aim, then it degenerates into chaos immediately, and no one can get along. So there's a rule for belonging to the community, and the rule has to be that you have to act in a manner that sustains the community and increases its competence. That's the fundamental moral obligation for belonging. Well, and obviously so, right? Because why would you walk into a clubhouse that was on fire? Like, that's just not smart, right? If you're going to be part of the game, if you've decided that being part of the game is worthwhile, you've also taken on the moral. You've also decided, even if you didn't notice it, that you have to work to support that game, because by deciding to play that game, you've said that it's valuable. And if it's valuable, then obviously you should work to sustain and expand it, because that's the definition of having a relationship with something that's valuable. And so that's the criteria for membership in the community. And that's partly why, if you regard the cross, say, as the symbol of voluntary suffering, suffering accepted voluntarily, something like that, which means that there's another element of that too that's worth thinking about. So, the reason that Cain gets so out of hand is because he's suffering, and he won't accept it. He certainly won't accept responsibility for it. He's angry and bitter about it. And no wonder, right? I mean, we have to be realistic about these sorts of things. You guys, all of you people, are going to suffer at some point in your life, to the point where you're angry and bitter about it. I mean, there's just absolutely no doubt about that. And you're even going to think, well, it's no bloody wonder that I'm angry and bitter about it. Everyone would be, and things are so god-awful that there's no excuse for them to even exist. And that's a powerful argument, although I think it's ultimately self-defeating. Well, that's kind of what the story of Cain and Abel, what would you say? That's the moral of the story of Cain and Abel, essentially.